Building a modern nation-state requires a specific cultural labor, the standardization of a national language. Classic modernist theories look at this process horizontally. A state selects a vernacular and expands it to its borders. But this ignores what happens once a language is dominant, the vertical dimension, the language's internal depth, comprising its registers, canon, and lexical range. This internal depth is the target of repertoire nationalization. Nationalizing states curate this vertical depth, deciding which historical texts and expressions are officially consecrated as high culture. This creates an analytical challenge. Both autocracies and democracies manage their language repertoires using an identical vocabulary of democracy and freedom. To understand modern nation-building, particularly in democracies where overt force is unavailable, we must look past the horizontal choice of language and analyze the vertical curation of repertoire depth. Evaluating how different regimes manipulate high culture requires a comparative model. Our first axis is coercion. At the top sits the coercive pole, defined by prohibition and the destruction of texts. At the bottom is the curatorial pole, where the state reweights prestige through schools and the market without banning alternatives. The horizontal axis is legitimation. On the left is authoritarian masking, where democratic rhetoric substitutes for accountability. On the right is civic truthful legitimation, where the appeal to the people corresponds to an actually contestable order. Mao-era China's Destroy the Four Olds campaign occupies the extreme top left of this matrix. The campaign was maximally coercive, purging the classical canon, while being justified through the rhetoric of a people's democratic dictatorship. The second data point is the authoritarian Kuomintang, or KMT era in Taiwan, a crucial within-polity baseline, because it occupied the same territory we see today. The KMT pursued a coercive repertoire nationalization, imposing a Mandarin-only, classically anchored high culture, while suppressing and penalizing native Taiwanese languages in schools and media. Despite decades of martial law and censorship, the regime legitimized this cultural control under the banner of Free China. On the matrix, the KMT sits in the top left quadrant. The specific mechanics of its coercion differed from Mao's, but the masking tactic was the same. Clearly adopt democratic vocabulary, analysts cannot evaluate a state by its rhetoric. They must test the structural accountability underlying that rhetoric. This framework allows us to test the contemporary case, Taiwan under President Tsai Ing-wen. The centerpiece of recent cultural intervention is the 2019 curriculum revision, which reduced the required share of classical Chinese in favor of vernacular and local writers. Critics frame this as a totalitarian-style assault on a natural, apolitical Chinese cultural inheritance. But the KMT baseline reveals that the status quo ante was not a state of nature. The dominance of the classical canon was itself a constructed high culture, forcibly imposed by a prior authoritarian project. The Tsai-era reforms are better understood as a curatorial counter-nationalization. The state is replacing one consecrated high culture with another, while changing the mode of delivery. Unlike the KMT era, democratic Taiwan uses curriculum weighting and discretionary subsidies. Classical Chinese remains legally available, and no one is penalized for its use. This curatorial approach is mirrored in the National Languages Development Act, which restitutes native languages without banning Mandarin. Characterizing these reforms as a totalitarian destruction of language is an analytic error. They represent an accountable revision of a prior coercive imposition. How does curatorial recanonization actually change behavior if the state refuses to use force? It works through Pierre Bourdieu's linguistic market. Language competence is a form of capital, and the state sets its exchange rate through the school exam. By reducing the required share of classical Chinese on exams, the state depreciates its credentialed value. Families rationally redirect their study hours, making the abandonment of the classical repertoire feel like a personal choice rather than a state imposition. While the state manages the curriculum from the top down, society performs its own work from the bottom up. On the Taiwanese internet, the Zuyu Jingcha, or China-speak police, actively flag and correct PRC vocabulary creeping into local online speech. This is a textbook instance of banal nationalism. Ordinary citizens perform lexical boundary policing to defend their national self from a linguistic other. This creates a multi-layered field. The state expands linguistic diversity from above, while citizens spontaneously police lexical purity from below. Repertoire nationalization in a democracy is a distributed, multi-agent achievement. It combines state-led market curation with societal boundary work, bypassing the need for a top-down conspiracy. Our comparative analysis allows us to finalize Tsai-era Taiwan's position in the theoretical matrix. The democratic case sits in the territorial, civic-truthful quadrant. The civic national discourse used to legitimize these reforms is truthful because it describes an order that is factually accountable, electoral, and reversible. This configuration of curation and accountability produces the curatorial paradox. Soft, truthfully legitimated curation is more durable than authoritarian coercion because citizens internalize the resulting change as a personal choice. Coercive regimes impose cultural change by force, which reliably provokes resistance and is often reversed the moment the regime falls. Because curatorial change relies on market incentives, its effects are latent. On a 50-year timeline, policy disruption remains flat, while generational repertoire depth curves downward almost invisibly. The degradation of the repertoire only becomes legible longitudinally across cohorts as the depreciated competence slowly drops out of households and media. This latency has a political consequence. Because the loss is slow and diffuse, it denies opponents a single mobilizing grievance to rally against. Furthermore, truthful civic discourse can raise the cost of dissent by rhetorically framing anyone who opposes curriculum reform as an opponent of democracy itself. The most consequential cultural nation-building is often the least visible. We must untangle the concept of nationalizing force from illiberalism, recognizing that the quiet curation of the linguistic market can reshape a nation's high culture far more permanently than a dictator's ban.